I'm Kelly O'Brien. I run O'Brien Editorial. We're a very small US-based agency, and we do a mix of documentation and technical copywriting, mostly for small Drupal shops and very big enterprise software developers, a lot in the higher ed space. So most of what I write these days is very technical for a very technical audience, but that was not always the case. I actually went to school for journalism, and I spent the early years of my career as a magazine writer and editor. And I wrote for a lot of very, very different publications. I wrote about food culture in remote northern Chinese cities. I wrote about trends in eco-friendly construction materials, because that's really fun. I wrote a piece about best practices for beekeeping on a small Caribbean island. So the range of publications that I wrote for was very broad, and that taught me a lot about different kinds of readerships and how to figure out what they're about and how to slant your writing so that it really engages the specific audience that you're writing for. So that's what I'm going to talk about today, is engaging your readers. So reader engagement can be kind of like a nebulous, fuzzy concept, but it's super, super critical to any kind of writing, but I think particularly to documentation, because a lot of times we're writing about very technical subjects, and I don't care how organized or polished or comprehensive your docs are, if your writing doesn't engage your readers, nobody's going to stick around long enough to pay attention to all of this hard work that you put in. So I want to share 4 techniques that I used as a magazine writer to engage all of these different kinds of readers, and have now since used to build a successful technical writing business, because readers are readers, whatever you're writing about. So before we talk, though, about how to engage your readers, I want to make sure we're all using the same definition of the term. So we'll start with the dictionary definition, because it's a good place to start. To engage, verb, to hold the attention of, and this is important. I mean, we need our readers to be paying attention to us, but I think in particular for documentation, it's more than just their attention that we need. We really need to earn their trust, so that when they run into problems over and over again, they know that they can rely on our documentation to help them out. So there are 4 specific things, which coincidentally will correspond to the 4 techniques I'm going to talk about. There are these 4 things that they really need to trust us to do. They need to trust that we understand where they're coming from. We need to know, who they are and what the circumstances are that they're working under, so that we can really make sure that we prioritize their needs in our documentation. They need to trust that we sympathize with their frustrations, because a lot of times when our readers come to our documentation, they've tried to do it themselves, they've Googled it, they've talked to other people about it, and they're at their wits' end. So we need to make sure that they know that we understand that they might be frustrated, and we're going to help them out. They need to trust that we know what they need to accomplish. We know what tasks are most important to them and how they prioritize those tasks, and we need to show them that we get what they need, and we're going to give it to them. And they need to trust that everything that we're doing in our documentation, no matter how much we're asking them to read, it will be worth reading it, because it's going to help them solve their problems. So if our documentation fails to do any of those things, there are dire consequences. If we fail to do this stuff, they're going to put our documentation on a shelf or in some forgotten directory somewhere, and they will never open them up again. So I'm going to talk about 4 different varieties of doc death that we're going to avoid with these 4 techniques. So the first one is death by apathy. I want you to think of your readers a little bit like teenagers, in that they are totally convinced that the entire universe revolves around them, and if they ever suspect that we don't think that too, that our documentation does not have them at the center of everything, they are going to turn up their music and pull up Twitter and totally tune us out. And unlike teenagers, they are very unlikely to grow up and one day appreciate all of the hard work we've done for them. They'll never give us another chance. So in order to prevent this, we have to fight apathy with empathy. So we need to have a very clear idea of who our readers are and what they care about, and make sure that everything that we put down on the page expresses that we care about that too, that their needs are the thing that get us out of bed in the morning, and helping them solve their problems are the most important thing to us. So the first, let's point that in the right direction. The first thing that that you need to recognize before you can really start to get into your readers' heads and figure out what their needs are, is that the things that are most important to your readers are not necessarily going to be the same things that are most important to you. And this is something that I learned as a journalist first, but then was reminded of when I became a technical writer. My very first set of documentation was for a Drupal shop. They had built this distribution for schools specifically, and so they had this site template set up, and they had different sections of the site for the different departments, and they had a way to associate users with each of those different departments. And so when I sat down with these guys to talk about the product and start thinking about how I was going to write the documentation, most of what they talked to me about was the modules that they used and the way that they adapted them to, it was a very clever distribution. It worked really well, but the information that I got from them was all about the back end and the architecture of the site. And so when I sat down to write the documentation, the things that they were really excited to tell me about were, how the site was built. And that was not at all what my readers needed to know. They needed to know how to use the site, how to create a user, and how to associate them with that department, and I didn't need to explain what organic groups was and how it works. So that disconnect is sometimes a little bit difficult to see, especially if you were on the team that built the tool. It's very difficult to get the distance that you need to see the difference between what's most important to you and what's most important to your readers. But they are different, and once you sort of internalize that, it gets a lot easier to figure out who your readers are. In fact, the process for figuring out who your readers are and what their needs are is, if any of you have ever had a conversation about user experience, it's very much the same. You want to approach them the same way. You have to ask all of these questions about, build a picture in your head of who this user is, and what they care about, and what they struggle with, and what their habits are and their preferences are, and use that to answer this question. What do they need? What do they need from me? So these questions are what are going to help you understand who your user is and what their needs are and how to prioritize them, and that's going to make engaging them a lot easier. So the second form of doc death we have to worry about is death by alienation. In addition to being kind of self-centered, readers can be a very sensitive bunch. If they ever feel like you're talking down to them, or that you're not taking what they need to do seriously, or just that you're not 100% on their side and there for them when they need you, they're going to put your docs down and never bother with them again. Because if they don't get the sense that you are there with them and helping them out, then why are they going to bother reading? So the thing that is going to help you most convey this emotional connection with your reader, I think, is your tone of voice in your documentation, and it's very much the same as your tone of voice when you're talking to someone. But it's super. The changes you make to control the tone of voice in documentation or in any writing can be pretty minor, but it is a super powerful way to really get your readers to start trusting you and give them a sense of who you are behind your documentation, and that's really central to engaging them. So when I think about tone of voice, I tend to think about it in terms of formality, and I have this spectrum in my head that I always go to when I sit down and start to write. And at one end, I have a very authoritative, academic, kind of instructive, formal voice. And then at the other, I have this totally chill, very relaxed, very friendly, uses much more slang and fewer technical terms, and is a little bit more hand-holding. And so those are kind of the two extremes on this spectrum. And everything that you write is going to fall somewhere along those lines. So one of the most, I guess, deliberate tone of voice decisions I ever had to make while writing docs was, I had this client who had built a site for someone, and the site owner came back to them and said, okay, we love the site, it's great, but we have this old legacy system and we need it to connect to the new site, and can you build that for us? And my client's like, sure, it's going to cost this much money and take this much time. And the site owner was like, we we don't have that much money and we don't really have that much time, so what else can you do for us? And so they built this really clunky workaround that did the job, but in order to get it to work, it was like this, process of 100 easy steps, and it was very, it was not intuitive, let's just put it that way. And to complicate matters, the people who were going to be using this workaround were their tech savvy was pretty limited, and so they were really intimidated by this process, but they had to do it. And so when my client came to me and asked me to write the documentation for this new feature set, they made me aware of the situation, and so I wrote this set of docs with a very conversational, very friendly style, because I knew that the people who were going to be using it were intimidated by the process and really needed their handheld and needed to be reassured that they really could do it and it really was going to be okay. And I got, I imagine you guys have experienced this too. We don't often get feedback from the people who are reading our docs directly, but I actually got feedback on these docs that came all the way from the site owner and through my client, that they really appreciated that they were, an informal and friendly tone of voice to get them through this. So it can be a really powerful tool. I think for any set of docs, when you're deciding where on the spectrum they're going to fall, there are 3 big considerations that you need to take into account. The first one is going to be the company culture, and I mean this one is pretty obvious, the branding, and that it's often the case that when they come to you and ask you to write documentation, they have some idea of where they want that tone to fall. Big, slick corporate clients are going to be a little bit more formal, small, young startups are going to be a little bit more informal, so that's definitely something that you have to take into account. The second one is what purpose do your docs serve? If you're writing a set of FAQs, for example, that's a quick fix. They show up, they find the question that they have, they find the answer. You've got a limited time to engage them, so you can be a little bit more voicey and more informal. Whereas if you're writing a huge, set of comprehensive, a huge comprehensive user manual, it's more likely that your readers are there to be educated and are going to stick with you for, a more in-depth discussion of stuff. And then the third is how tech savvy your readers are, and this example with the feature set docs is a great example of that, because if you're a developer and you're writing for other developers, you can afford to use a little bit more technical jargon, you can go through big technical concepts more quickly without worrying about disengaging your readers. But if your audience is less technically savvy, then you definitely want to make sure that you hold their hand a little bit more with your tongue. So I think it's not often that you get to make the tone decision about your documentation totally unilaterally. There are going to be other people who have input. Whoever hired you to do it is going to have an opinion about this. But even if you don't get to make the final decision about it, I think it's really important to think through each of these really carefully, so that whatever tone, wherever on that spectrum you decide to fall, you're doing it really deliberately and consistently throughout your docs. So the next form of doc death that we have to worry about is death by impatience. And I mentioned this a little bit before, by the time that our readers get to our documentation, they are often already kind of frustrated because they've tried some things before and they're not getting the answers they want. So if by the time they get to our documentation, they still have to spend time hunting for what they need, your docs are going to be in trouble. So the solution to this one is to lead with the problem. You want to take the content of your documentation and organize it by the problems that it solves. For each section, for each page, for each chapter, whatever, for each unit of your documentation, you need to make it clear from the very beginning what your readers are going to get out of it if they read through that section, so that when they land on your docs, they can see, this is going to be relevant to me, and this is what is going to give me what I need. So there's this great test. This is actually another magazine thing that I've brought forward, and it's super useful and super easy. There's this great test to run on your docs to test whether or not they are problem-oriented enough already. So you take the section you've just finished writing and you pretend to be your reader, and you ask, if I read this, what's in it for me? And if at the beginning you read the first couple of sentences and you know what's going to be in it for you if you keep reading through the rest of the section, then you're in good shape. But if you don't, then you still have some work to do. So this question, what's in it for me, is actually, I'm going to stop using the words in the question. I'm going to talk about it as an acronym, WIFM. And I talk about this all the time with a lot of my writer friends. We use this when we were pitching magazines and when we were writing articles and blog posts and all of this stuff, because no matter whether it's documentation or other kinds of writing, it's really, really key to reader engagement, because they need to know, that they're spending their time wisely. When I spent some time, I spent some time writing this set of, this was, I think, the biggest set of docs I've ever written. It was like a 60-page ridiculous user manual, and it was for a site that, it was a publishing site, and the editorial workflow for this site was intense. They had several different, tiers of users, and one tier would draft the content, and then it had like 3 different editorial steps that it had to go through before it got published to the site live. So I spent a couple of weeks really digging into the workflow and figuring it out and building this beautiful little glyphy thing to illustrate it. And so I ended up with this very nice section, if I say so myself, about the editorial workflow. And I called it editorial workflow because I'm super creative like that. But when I went back to edit my first draft, I ran the WIFM test, and it became clear to me that there were not a lot of situations where my reader was going to say, all right, I'm having this problem, what's the section in the docs that are going to solve it? Editorial workflow doesn't answer very many of those questions. So I rewrote I changed the heading of the section to say, understanding how your content gets published, and then I added a couple of sentences at the beginning of the section that said, when you are creating a draft of your content, you have to understand that there are several steps that it has to go through before it's going to get published live on the site. And then the rest of the section was pretty much exactly what I'd written before, but asking what the WIFM for the reader was, and then moving it up front to the beginning of the section made it much more likely that my readers were going to know that that was the section that they needed. So, the easiest way to make the WIFM clear to your readers is literally just to say, this is what you're going to get if you read this. By the end of this section, you will know how to do this. You will know how to do that. And like in my example here, this, for me anyway, and this is going to differ from writer to writer, I imagine, but this always happens later in the writing process. Like my first pass at the docs is always just getting everything down on the page that I know I need to cover. And then running this WIFM check is something that I do in revisions, because it makes it much easier. It's harder to think about the WIFM before you've written the whole section. It's much easier to read through the section, ask what the WIFM is, and then really deliberately put that at the beginning so that you show your readers that you know what they need out of the docs, and this is what they're going to get if they read this part. So the last form of doc death that we have to worry about is death by disorientation. So readers have relatively short memories, or at the very least, they're easily confused. If you spend all of this time crafting this beautiful, super elegant definition of a term or explanation of a process, and then you have 2 kind of rambly paragraphs, and then you refer to that term that you defined 2 paragraphs ago, those rambly paragraphs are going to confuse them to the point where they don't remember what this beautiful term that you've defined is. So you need to watch out for anywhere in your documentation that your readers might ask, why are we talking about this here? Like, what does this have to do with what you were telling me before, or what you were telling me, or what I'm trying to get to? So the solution here is to use powerful pointers. And pointers are pointer sentences, and they serve as sort of signposts to keep your readers oriented in the broader context of your documentation. So you want to make sure that you're using them really deliberately, so that your readers never get to that, like, wait, why am I reading this again question? I found, when I was preparing this talk for this conference, I found that everyone I talked to about preparing the talk had the same piece of advice for me. They said, tell your readers, or tell your audience what you're going to tell them, and then tell them that, and then tell them what you've told them. So this may be familiar to some of you. But that's exactly what pointer sentences do for your documentation. They recap the last section that you went over. They say, all right, this section, we're going to be talking about that, and then they give you a heads up of what's going to come up in the next section, so that you can, when you're reading this stuff, you know how it fits into the bigger picture. So pointers give your readers this sort of contextual structure for the information that you're communicating to them. My favorite example of pointer sentences kind of coming to the rescue, or maybe the most dire example of when there needed to be pointer sentences and weren't, was I had one of my higher ed clients came to me with a set, well, actually like several sets of training workbooks. And their product is like a business intelligence reporting kind of thing that sits on top of banner databases at colleges and universities. And so when a college or university buys this, they have this whole week-long training thing. And so I was helping them edit their training manuals for this really, it's a beautiful product and it's very powerful, but it's, again, not particularly intuitive. So the training manager and her staff would give me these drafts, and I would have to turn them into something that they could actually use. And when I got the drafts, they'd be like 10-page long, they were very clear, they were very precise, but it would be a 10-page long bullet list of click this button, fill this out, select this value, click this next button. And it technically did what it needed to do, but there was no context at all. It was just this huge monolithic flood of information that nobody was really going to be able to get their head around because it didn't have any pointer sentences. So when in the editing process rewriting process is maybe more accurate, I broke that list of 150 steps into chunks of 6 steps or 10 steps, and then each of those had a pointer sentence or two that said, okay, this next set of steps is going to do this for you, and this next set of steps is going to do that for you, which we'll build on later to do this other thing. And so, I didn't write the content. I don't know how to write SQL queries. Like, this was not something that technically I was, able to write from scratch. But adding pointer sentences made the content much easier for my readers to digest. So that's really the chief, I guess, benefit of pointer sentences, but I did say that they were powerful. And the reason that they're so powerful is that in addition to providing that contextual structure for your readers, they're also the place that you're going to use those other 3 techniques that we talked about. They're the place that you are going to be able to reassure your readers that their needs are what you're concerned about and their needs are what comes first in your writing. They're the place that you're going to remind your readers that you're there for them and employ that tone, whether it's the authoritative tone or the conversational tone. And it's the pointer sentences very naturally are the place that you're going to communicate with them and what they're going to get out of it if they keep reading in this section. So they not only are pointer sentences super powerful for your readers, but they also, when you land on a spot in your documentation that you realize needs another pointer sentence, it's a good reminder to think about these other 3 techniques too, because that's where you're going to want to take advantage of them. So, like I said at the beginning of the talk, it really doesn't matter how much effort you put in and how polished and how organized your documentation your documentation is. There you go. If you don't engage your readers, it's not going to matter. They're not going to stick around long enough to hear what you're trying to tell them. So now you have, hopefully, these 4 techniques that are going to help you be really mindful of your readers and engage them. You're going to figure out who they are and ask all of those critical questions about what they care about and what they struggle with, and use that to figure out what their needs are so that you can make sure that you put those first. You're going to think about what tone of voice they're going to be most comfortable with, what is most likely to make them trust you and rely on you and come back to your documentation. You're going to organize your content according to the problems that it solves so that your readers don't have to waste any time sifting through your documentation to figure out what's in it for them if they're going to read this section versus that section. And you're going to use these pointer sentences to give them context to the information that you're communicating and put these other 3 techniques to use. So most of you probably do some of this already. It's out there in the universe, but the more that you use these techniques and the more mindful you are of these questions that you have to ask, the more deeply you're going to be able to engage with your readers and get them to come back to your docs again and again. So I hope that was useful, or at the very least a little bit engaging, and I'm happy to take any questions, and if you don't have questions now but something occurs to you later, I am online at all of these places, and you're welcome to reach out whenever you want. So thanks very much.
So I'm gonna ask the first question.
Go nuts.
Because that's what I get to do. So say you have kind of documentation that you're writing, but it's for multiple audiences. Like there's some people that come that'll be technical, some that will be just kind of users of the software.
Yep.
Do you know what's like the best way to kind of engage that group in general and kind of point them to where they're going to go without like, you know, embarrassing them? There's like if you don't know what you're doing, you know,
right.
something like that.
I'm sorry. I'm really glad you asked that question because that was something that I tried to work into my talk and couldn't figure out exactly where to put it. I think that that's one of the other advantages to being really careful with your pointer sentences, because if you can structure it so when you land at the beginning of a section and you say, you know, this is what this next section is going to cover, if the person who's reading it is technical enough to already know that, then they can just skip it and they know exactly what they're skipping. Whereas if, you know, the person who lands there and reads, you know, this is what this next section is going to cover, and that's unfamiliar to them, they're going to keep going and they'll get the information that they need. So I think that's at least how I try to scale is probably the wrong word, but that's how I try to make sure that nobody is wasting their time when they're reading my documentation, is making it clear that, like, if you need this is what this section is going to talk about. And if you don't, please proceed.
Okay, so I have two questions, or one remark and one. Sorry. The teenager bit.
Yes.
I've made the experience that on IRC it's much easier to convince people that they're not the center of the universe. If you have a little bit of patience to spare, you can sort of solve this problem and show them that they're not alone and other people have hit this problem, and if they also invest a little bit of patience, they'll get there eventually. So that's one bit. And another that I thought of when you were talking about those complex systems is how do you test documentation? Do you get access to the system to actually verify that what you just wrote is accurate?
Oh yeah.
Oh, okay, that's good.
Yeah. Oh yeah, no, I don't think I've ever run into, and maybe I'm just really lucky, I don't think I've ever run into a situation where one of my clients has asked me to write about something that I can't go and verify on the product itself. So, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. But yeah, I mean, all of my, when I'm writing for Drupal sites, they always give me access to their, you know, their stage servers and give me all of the admin logins that I need so that I can create new content and go through that whole editorial. I cannot tell you how much like dummy content I created to figure out all of the different steps to that editorial workflow process. It was so complicated. I had like 6 different users I had to keep track of that were all me. It was it was really intense. But yeah, I make sure that I write out the steps and then I go test them and make sure they really do what I'm saying that they do.
Christopher Tom, are you using any formal structure for writing documentation? Like, because I'm new to this world, and like it's really awesome that you're organizing this, because it kind of gives me access to like meeting people, like people here. But I've been to conferences from the DITA community, the Darwin Information Type community. And I don't know how many people here are familiar with that. Can we raise of hands? DITA, yeah. So like about half or less than half?
I'd be curious though to see how many people are familiar, but yeah, because I know what it is, but I never get to use it. Awesome.
Who actually uses it? Or has used it ever? Okay. So you haven't actually used it?
I think that has to do with who my clients are and how sophisticated their approach to documentation is. But yeah, no, most of what I do, I don't think I've ever actually delivered a set, like for each client that comes to me, what they need as deliverables is totally different, and it's never been something as sexy as DITA. Like it's always, we need a PDF.
Just give me some.
Awesome. Great. And I mean, sometimes it's a wiki and sometimes it's a page, but I've never gotten to use any of the fancy stuff, and I really want to.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
Any more questions? Oh, one more.
Hey, can somebody explain what this detail is?
Oh, yes, give it back to Christoph. He'll do a good job.
Sounds like a lightning dog.
Yeah, that's a perfect
Yes,
lightning
yes,
talk
that's a
if
very
anyone
good
wants
point.
to explain.
Any other questions?
Any other questions? Hello, hello.
When you talk about pointer sentences,
Yeah.
and you've got documentation sets that are updated by lots of people, you're introducing a lot of potential mistakes.
That is true. That's a great question. I actually, again, this is like, I think I've just been kind of lucky because most of the documentation I write is just me, and I am the sole authority. And so if somebody comes in and is like, well, why don't we say this way? I'll just be like, no, we're not going to do that. So yeah, I don't know. That's I think making sure, and again, I'm like kind of pulling this out of thin air because I don't have experience with like community docs. But I think if this is, if you can, what's the word that I'm looking for? If you can communicate the idea of pointer sentences to the people who are going to be collaborating, then at the very least people will be paying attention to the beginning and end of sections where those pointer sentences really need to go. So even if there's lots of editing that's going on in the middle, making sure that the signposts are accurate, at least those are, it's a smaller amount of real estate that you have to cover. Like there are specific points that you can make sure stay up to date rather than having to go sentence by sentence by sentence by sentence. And so keeping that structure intact, I think. If you can get everybody on the same page, that might be a way to. But like that's so easy.
Good luck with that.
Yeah, sorry, I don't have a really good answer to that.
Code review, basically. Like when something new comes in, you just say, okay, this doesn't fit. So that's one way to get new users who haven't read your style guide yet.
Right. Oh, the style guide.
To fix their sentences or how it fits into the whole
Right,
thing.
make sure it fits into the structure. Yeah, okay, that's
So
a good
that's
point.
the simplest way.
Yeah.
Do you put tone in the style guide?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yes, I do. No.
Next question.
No, I actually, I just wrote a template the other day for, what was that for? Oh, for like smaller versions of the training manuals that I was talking about, because they like the same client releases these little tech talks that are like, okay, here's a thing you need to do, a single task, and here are these steps to do it. And so it's not part of a broader set of documentation. It's just an individual like exercise. And so I was getting tired of having all of the different writers come to me with like it had nothing to do with any of the tech talks that had previously been published. Nobody had looked at the format or any of the style. So I came up with a Word template that just has, when you open up a new one, it has 3 paragraphs that talk about, here's the formatting stuff that, the fonts you have to use, and this is what you bold, and this is when you use bullet points. And then there's a second paragraph that talks about the tone, and this is the tone that we try and strike with these, tech talks, and be mindful of this thing and that thing. And I definitely define voice and try and get people, try being the operative word, but try and get people to think about that when they come and write an initial draft of that. So, yeah.
These internal documents, they can be a lot more less formal.
Yeah. Yes.
And this is where you can engage the writers.
Mm-hmm.
So
yes.
It's like meta.
Yes, it totally is. I've never really thought about it that way, but that's totally true. Yeah.
This is where you can throw in all the jokes as well. You're talking to the people that you're working with, and then they can can sort of communicate whatever the general, more
Right.
toned down tone
Right.
to the actual outside world.
Right. Yeah, but in those initial ones, you can be like, we're going to talk about this today. Everyone's favorite process. Like,
Let me see where I put my
Anyone else?
even better.
Cool.
awesome.
Thank you, Cal.
Thank you guys.